And we're live. All right. Hello, everyone. This is Adrian Alvarado here, and you are tuned in to another episode of the Bori Channel podcast. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of having with us J. Stephen Roberts from the Real Crusades History Channel YouTube. And he has been an incredible force for history and for the community at large. Really, he holds a degree in medieval history. He's the leader of a dedicated team with the Real Crusades history that are really just trying to get unsullied history to the common man. He's a published author. He's a historian and even a musician. I don't know how he does it. I don't know how he does all this stuff, but now he's putting on another thing on his plate. He is actually helping to create a TV series where he's the chief historical advisor. And this show is called Knights of the Cross. We've talked about it a little bit before, but wow, what a story it is, and what a pleasure it is to have you on the show. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thanks, Adrian. I appreciate it. Thanks for the kind introduction. It's most of that's not really deserved, but I do appreciate the kind words.
Well,
thanks.
it's real. It's authentic. You've been a huge influence on me personally. But I just kind of want to open up a little bit and ask kind of how you got your start. Like, how did you get interested in history? What's your origin story of sorts? What's the history of J. Stephen Roberts?
Well, I mean, I kind of got into the Crusades. The Crusades were what got me into history in the first place. I read this book many, many years ago about Queen Isabel I of Castile, and was just really fascinated by her story and this whole aspect of, this queen who completed this centuries-long crusade and all her ancestors who were involved in it, and just kind of the scope of it. And, there's a romantic quality to it that sort of, I think, drew me in. It just got me really hooked ever since. And I've just been really fascinated by history ever since. And I did study, one of my degrees, I did history, I did the medieval concentration. So I think that's kind of where, the idea that I have a degree in medieval history comes from. But yeah, it's, that was a great experience, studying history, formally. But I mean, obviously most of my interest and studies have just been personally driven and just continuously reading about this stuff, for years and years and years.
Yeah. And I mean, I can say for sure that, when it comes to learning about history, it was something that really just changed my life too. And it's interesting you mentioned Queen Isabel, because I have a personal fascination, especially with Hispanic history and such. And so it's interesting the role that Spain played in the Crusades. Just for me, just to see that sort of battle taken on for 7 centuries. It's something that's really incredible. But for this TV show, I'm noticing that I'm very lucky that I got to see the pilot. It looks really good. It looks really exciting. But the protagonist is Richard the Lionheart, of England. An incredible icon, a huge bulwark of a man. And so, could you give us a little bit of an intro to Richard Lionheart and maybe why he was chosen to be the protagonist of the show?
Well, he's kind of the quintessential crusader. He is pretty well known. I do think I know that the guys who have been working on the show with us, the production team, and they were all like, "You mean from Robin Hood?" And I think that is kind of where a lot of people know him. But he's a pretty fascinating figure. I mean, he was a kind of a military genius. He won all kinds of battles, but he was also really dedicated to this idea of crusading. And he kind of came of age, and he became King of England at the height of crusading, when crusading had really become an institutional thing in the Christian world, and where it really had become kind of the ideal. I mean, it was the thing that young men of the warrior elite sought to do, and really something that was celebrated from every strata of society. And there was already like a huge poetic tradition around it. So by the time he comes around, crusading's been going on for about a century. And this is something that just obviously really moved him. And he decided once he became king, he pretty much set out on crusade immediately, which was probably not in terms of just like being realpolitik. It really wasn't. I mean, his mother, who was an important figure at the time, Eleanor of Aquitaine, discouraged him from going. A lot of his advisors didn't want him to go. It's not really a practical thing to do, especially like as soon as you get on the throne. But it just kind of shows his devotion to that. And I think it was a combination of the dedication to that knightly ideal, as well as just this deeply held Christian faith, because, you know, this is somebody who he was a great warrior. He was a very tough fighting man, but he also was extremely religious. I mean, when he would attend mass, he would sing along with the monks. He knew, he knew the mass very deeply. So he really kind of is the quintessential crusader. And I think his story, you know, he's kind of known popularly. People kind of think, oh, okay, well, this guy was just kind of like a, kind of a Terminator, which he was on the battlefield, but he was also somebody who was in tune with the higher things as well. I mean, he had a very deep prayer life. He was a poet. He was a musician. I think he really felt obligated to Christendom to undertake this crusade, which was very dangerous and, could have possibly even destroyed his career as king, by doing this. But he did this out of that really intense dedication. And the stuff he was able to achieve while he was over there is just legendary, and it's astounding, and it's stuff that almost you can barely believe that this is actual history, but it's very well documented both on the Muslim and Christian sides. And in fact, some of the most interesting stuff about him is recorded by the Muslims, who were fascinated by him, as were many people, many of his contemporaries. So that's why we picked him. I think, on the one hand, we wanted to get, people more familiar with his story. And also we thought that he was the best vehicle to communicate what we wanted to communicate about the Crusades, which is that the Crusades really, especially for the way Latin Christians at the time perceived it, the Crusades were an act of brotherly love.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And, and I wanted to get a little bit of background about Richard the Lionheart, because we have, a clip here that was provided from the pilot episode, something, that isn't, I saw this clip, and I'm very excited to share. It's an exclusive little clip for everyone watching. And it's, and so we get a little bit of a peek into the spiritual life of Richard the Lionheart.
Continue with our preparations. Tell the men to pray for strength and for the king. Come, my lady. We must pray.
Father, I repent of my sins, but most of all my doubt in your will. Father, if you love my brother as much as I, please heal him, that he may fulfill this mission ye have bestowed upon him.
My son. My son.
Father.
Yes, 'tis I, Henry, the once mighty King of England.
What is this place?
A land between worlds, riddled with suffering and regret.
Hell.
Purgatory, the prison of souls.
Am I dead?
Not yet.
Why have I been brought here?
Listen well, my boy. Nothing matters but the work of the Lord. You are his king. His people are suffering, and you must deliver them.
I am trying.
In life, I did not honor God as I should have. All that I fought for was dust and ashes, nothing. I neglected my true duty to Jerusalem, to the Lord. Do not err how I have, my boy. You must be the king that I could not be.
Father.
Go, my son.
Father.
Remember your vow.
I will uphold it, Father. My lord.
Yes.
Saladin's forces are beginning to advance, as well as a garrison of men at Acre. We will be overwhelmed.
So, can you talk a little bit about that clip?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of my favorite parts. The inspiration for that idea comes from this book I'm writing about the Third Crusade, which I've actually pretty much already written it. It's kind of going to be my second historical novel. But I had this scene where Richard, he wakes up from after he's been ill for a long time, and he talks to one of his knights about having seen his father in purgatory. And so that's kind of where the inspiration from it comes from. I mean, this isn't something that we have recorded specifically from history, but it is a very, believable thing based on the types of things that I think would have been haunting Richard. And, Richard's relationship with his father was a tough issue that he dealt with. The idea, his father was Henry II of England, who was one of the most successful and powerful medieval kings of England, who ruled most of France as well during his time, basically left behind an empire, which Richard inherited. And Henry was concerned about the Holy Land, and he was asked several times to help, with what was going on in the Holy Land. And he gave a lot of money, but he never went himself, which is what the Christians there wanted. And it's kind of like one of those things where, in some ways, I do think he really was dedicated to the Crusades, and he really did show a lot of initiative in trying to help. But like a lot of kings, he stopped short of actually going himself. Is this the kind of, and at the same time, his life was mainly dedicated to this political struggle with the King of France. And so that's one of the themes that we wanted to explore with the show. And I think we'll get deeper into as the series goes. It's also something that comes up a lot in this novel I'm doing about the Third Crusade, where it's kind of there's this need on the one hand for somebody like King Richard or King Henry to fulfill their role as a king. They have expectations from the elements in society from which they derive their power, the nobility, the various factions within their own dynasties, to be politically successful. And a lot of times that is kind of at conflict with this, what was kind of at the time considered this higher goal, which was the goal of the crusade, the goal to perform what was called the business of God, the work of God. There was this calling, and the church was kind of constantly reminding the warrior elite that this was what they really needed to be doing. They should be setting aside worldly concerns, especially fighting each other, like this long running feud between the kings of France and England. This is not what we should be doing. We should be in the Holy Land fighting the enemies of God and protecting Christians who are in peril there, and protecting Christ's holy sites as well, because the idea is that this is Christ's inheritance there in Jerusalem. It's a city that was made sacred by his life and his death and his resurrection.
That's fascinating. I mean, that is really fascinating, because I was kind of wondering myself, why would King Henry be in purgatory? And you're saying it's because he was kind of falling short of that crusade, of that mission, of taking the Holy Land. And is that maybe why? Is that maybe why Richard the Lionheart would also be in there as well in the purgatory?
Well, I think the idea in this scene is that Richard is ill when this is happening, and he's seeing a vision. So he's not actually in purgatory. He's seeing his father in purgatory. The idea is that Henry dedicated himself to worldly affairs, toward political affairs, and to some extent did neglect the Holy Land. And, I think for Catholics, there's kind of always been this assumption that unless you're a saint, you're going to spend some time in purgatory. And often it's even kind of assumed that if you're a ruler, if you're somebody who's powerful, then you're lucky to get into purgatory at all, So I think, Henry II definitely wasn't a saint. I mean, he was supposedly responsible for the death of St. Thomas Becket, and he had, feuds with the church. He was somebody whose life was centered around building this incredible political empire, which he did. But he also was kind of a bad father. He really alienated all of his children. He alienated his wife. He has that reputation for being someone who left behind a big dynastic mess. And a big part of that was because he alienated his sons, including Richard, who was one of the ones who he was in some ways closest to, even though they had a lot of tension. But I think the idea here is really to delve into some of the internal conflicts within Richard. On the one hand, the whole time he was in the Holy Land, he was kind of feeling pulled back toward his political role. There was he was constantly getting messages from back home saying, hey, you need to come back. You need to come back. The King of France is attacking our lands. There's, we need you here. And he in a lot of ways, I think we can imagine him. He was somebody who wanted to be in two places at once, but he spent a long time in the Holy Land, and he really did dedicate himself to the Holy Land when a lot of other rulers refused to do that. I mean, the King of France, for example, went on this crusade as well, but pretty much turned back very early and went home, in part because he wanted to attack Richard's lands. So I think that's what we really wanted to show here. We wanted to show that Richard was somebody who was really driven by this higher purpose, the crusade, but that the more mundane concerns of his position as king were constantly nagging at him.
So there's a bit of an interplay there. No, that's really fascinating, because when you're talking about Henry sort of being like a poor patriarch, being more interested in the earthly, and then Richard, for whatever reason, which is kind of interesting for me to wonder about and ponder about, what made him so motivated, what made him so dedicated. But maybe this is something that we just can't comprehend, because this is just a very personal thing.
Well, I personally think there's a couple of things we can pinpoint on. Part of it is his cultural background. He was somebody who kind of had heritage in England as well as in parts of France, especially the south of France, where his mother was from. He was very close to his mother, and she was very dedicated to this courtly, poetic culture that celebrated great chivalric deeds. That really resonated with Richard. He was a musician himself. He composed some of his own troubadour music, and I think that was a big part of it. But I also think he was genuinely pious. He was seriously dedicated to this spiritual aspect of this. He was a very religious man. He was also a very capable politician as well. I mean, he did devote a lot of his energy to his political career, and he was quite successful at that. But the first thing he did was this thing in the Holy Land, was the crusade, and I think that in itself speaks volumes. I mean, it's kind of hard for us to imagine the amount of risk that was involved in doing this. I mean, he raised this very large army and transported it across the Mediterranean. That was like going across the world at the time. And he really was risking everything to do this. A sensible person would have stayed home and just focused on ruling his kingdom.
Yeah, but like you're saying, it's so easy for moderns to not understand piety, not understand being motivated by something external, right? Instead of something sort of like tangible, right? Some and so what you're saying is incredibly true, and kind of I guess I kind of want to segue a little bit here. I think there's a lot of lessons there to learn. There's a lot of lessons to learn from the mindset of a crusader, the mindset of the medieval that we don't understand today. Is this why the series got started? Does this play into why the series got started to be made?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are really good points, and I think you're right. And this is something that we want to do with this series, is get into the mentality of medieval people. Why were the Crusades so important? I mean, what was so important about this? You get movies like Kingdom of Heaven, which just say, oh, well, it was about greed. It was about, just a love of conquest. And that doesn't explain it at all, because people who cared about conquest and cared about greed didn't go on crusade. They conquered things that were nearby and that would make them money. People who went on crusade impoverished themselves and put themselves and their entire political career, whatever they happened to have, whether they were a peasant to a king, you would basically risk everything by doing this. And what you were saying earlier, I think does kind of get at the heart of it. The medieval world was a time of faith, and it was a time where people genuinely felt that there was this higher spiritual reality, that God was real, and this was the most important thing, in a way that I think is, we do have people who are devout today, but I do think in our world today, it is really hard to understand that type of feeling that these people had, because, we live in this kind of materialistic way of looking at things. I think even for a lot of Christians, it's hard to imagine this mentality that people had. I mean, I think when you spend a lot of time reading medieval writings, you kind of get more of a sense of it. But this was just very real to people. I mean, it wasn't like, well, this should be the thing I think, or I kind of, I wish I thought this way. It was there. I mean, like rulers were afraid to offend God. I think even people who were not particularly pious, the way we might think of it, maybe didn't have like that drive. They feared God's anger. I think this was an age when people feared God's anger and felt that really this was ultimately where power lay. And that's a very different type of world than I think the world we live in, or even like, it's kind of funny. Like anytime I go back and read stuff about ancient Rome, I spend so much time reading about the medieval world. When I go back and read ancient Rome, there's something about it that almost seems more familiar. It almost seems more like our world. Like this is a time when these politicians and these guys vying for power, to run Rome or whatever it is, they were the power. I mean, they were, and medieval people really didn't think that way. I mean, they really thought that, they felt that they would be held accountable for the things they did. And it was, for a lot of people, that was very terrifying, because there were rulers who committed very serious sins, and they did a lot of things to try to make amends for it later in life, often.
I was talking to some friends about this actually just yesterday, about you were mentioning there a little bit about how the Catholics of the Middle Ages were, a different breed, right? And so, for Christians today, even Catholics today, there's almost like an expectation for your faith to be something very private, very personal. And so, we were talking about sort of the kingship, right? The kingship of Christ, right? Because Jesus Christ can be the king of your heart. He's also king of the universe. But in between, sometimes we forget sort of the practical of, for a medieval, Christ was king of the realm too. And so the kings were answerable to God in a way that is just very foreign and very difficult for a lot of people to understand today. And so what you're saying is entirely true. And, on this channel, we talk about a little bit about stuff on the New World. And I think some of it is present too in the New World, especially in those first 2 centuries, that there was Christendom, was extended to a new realm. And sometimes people forget that. And sometimes people forget that that's kind of where their society came from. That's what it was founded on. I'm not sure if you have anything to say about that.
No, I mean, I'm really fascinated by this, just because I do think that it's kind of one of the big dilemmas for human beings, is this issue of power. And, I kind of realized it recently, one Good Friday, sitting listening to the account of Jesus being put through a sham trial, where he's accused by false authorities. It kind of struck me, what was the commentary in that? Like, why did Christ choose to come to the world and endure that in particular, that type of injustice? It was a very particular type of injustice. He was being put through, he was being subject to illegitimate authorities. And, I think for medieval people, the only legitimate authority was God's authority. And if a king was not carrying out God's rule, he wasn't really even a valid king. And, at the height of Christendom, a pope could excommunicate you. You could face the wrath of the church, and it could destroy all of your authority because of this attitude. And I just think that there's something to that we maybe have lost in our civilization, where, human beings are never going to always behave well, and authorities and those who rule over us in particular need to be subject to oversight, I guess you could say. And in the medieval world, that was the case, and it was almost like more intense than any other type of oversight. Was God is going to judge the king harshest.
Yeah, and it's true, and that we've lost that. But I think the series is poised to make that clear to a new audience, right? Because when we can, I think that's kind of the beauty of a film, a video, of TV, is that when done well, right? And I think that I'm sure that's something that you're trying to ensure, right? The historical accuracy of this. I guess it's like, like for you, it's like, what is most important about that, about the historical accuracy? Is it the clothing? Is it the speech pattern? Or is it the mindset of the people that were there? I don't know. What's
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of different ways you can approach historical accuracy. And we definitely have tried to do that with costuming and the look of everything as much as possible. I mean, we try to stick to, the clothing that's going to be appropriate. Like there are areas where we haven't been able to, fully achieve the type of accuracy we want, just because of, limitations. But, we are comfortable with some limitations in that respect, as long as we can keep the basics solid, like the type of armor, the type of clothing. And I think we were able to do that with the pilot. And big shout out to a lot of people involved. For example, Sam Bakich, who is a good friend of the show, who brought a lot of the gear that we needed for the pilot and helped make the pilot look really accurate. Also, our production team from Cinema Forte, Aaron and Greg, and those guys just did an incredible job in terms of creating the environment. So yeah, I think for me, the mindset is a huge thing, though, because a lot of times when we look at medieval theme or Hollywood, when Hollywood does the Middle Ages, what they do is they take modern people and modern mindsets and just drop them in medieval costume. And so you end up not really having something that's authentically medieval. So one thing we did want to do was try to be faithful to the source material in such a way that the attitudes would come through, and we'd get like an authentic sense of, how these people actually would have behaved. Like a classic example is this, like a lot of medieval movies, they'll have the young woman who is rebelling against the idea that she has to have an arranged marriage, right? Like she's like, no, father, I'm going to marry for love, which is something that no medieval aristocratic young woman would have even thought that there was anything weird about, her marriage involving like a political alliance or something like that. That was just a given. But like allowing that kind of modern perception to intrude on the period kind of breaks frame. You no longer are really in the medieval world. So it's important to kind of pay attention to stuff like that and try to get it right so that it's faithful to the period.
Yeah. And I think that's really what people stand to benefit from, right? And for the people who are watching and don't know, what you're doing is something, really really grassroots. I mean, what you're doing is you've been working, with your producer to, basically, he's been making this a whole new sort of video streaming platform that is just entirely Christian content. And I think from what I'm understanding, this show is meant to be the flagship. It's meant to be the real big opener for original content. And so I think people stand to benefit from the mindset, from seeing that mindset of those people living in that day. Do you have any movies or shows that you think have influenced, or have done well the historical accuracy you're kind of getting at?
My main beef with so much stuff that's set in the Middle Ages is just that it's historically inaccurate. And honestly, like, I can't think of anything off the top of my head that that doesn't just violate the accuracy to such an extent that it's kind of hard to watch. I will say one of my favorite movies is Braveheart. It's horribly historically inaccurate, but it's just such a compelling story, and I think it's got a message in it that is still worth thinking about. And I think, it does to some extent get you into the issue of the Scottish War of Independence and some of the feelings there. But it's very historically inaccurate in just about every way. And most movies are like that. There is one movie called Arn the Knight Templar that I do kind of like. But yeah, with Christian Channel, I do think Austin is really trying to historical stuff is something he wants to do. And that's such a big part of Catholicism and Christianity in general. So I think it's something that Christians do need to draw from more often. So yeah, and just huge shout out to Austin for everything he's done. I mean, he came to me quite a while ago talking about doing this project, and when he first brought it up to me, it sounded crazy to me, but his tenacity is really admirable, and we've really come a long way. It amazes me that we've come as far as we have, and we've got this pilot done, and it's going to be coming out. So just FYI, anybody, if you have not done so, check out knightsofthecross.com. That's where you can learn all about the project and help contribute to it, because it is like you're saying, it is a crowdfunded project, and the generosity of our donors so far is what has enabled it to move forward and has gotten us to the point of making a pilot. So the pilot's done. It's going to be out. I believe November is the release date that Austin's shooting for. But so knightsofthecross.com is the place to go to learn about the project and to contribute if you want to.
And the producer Austin Kelly was kind enough to provide us with that sneak clip from the pilot, which again looks really, really good. But it is something that is being crowdfunded precisely for the reason of historical accuracy, precisely for the reason of making sure something like this, because I don't think anything like this can be made unless it's independent of studios that really kind of want to change the message, right? Because I think something like the Passion of the Christ couldn't have been made if you didn't have somebody at the helm that was dedicated to the vision of it. And I think sometimes even with content, right, that's made by Catholics, I think sometimes things like purgatory, like that clip that was just shown, like that would not be that people would be like, maybe we shouldn't include purgatory in this, right? Because maybe people won't agree, or they won't understand, or they might be put off by it. But then again, I think you're losing a little bit of what these people who were living in that time were thinking. That was in their head. That was already part of their mindset. And so I mean, what would you say about the level of contribution and the level of influence that the regular person has on a production like this?
I mean, it's huge. We've had already a fair amount of small donors and people who have contributed a little bit more. I mean, like we had our $1,000 donors all there for the filming of the pilot, which is a cool thing, by the way, for anybody who donates at some of the higher tiers. you will be there when we do the filming, and you will be able to be a part of that. And those guys all ended up as extras in the filming of the pilot, so you'll see them at the army scene where they are members of the army. So it's we put them in armor, and it's very cool. But yeah, it's definitely it's a labor of love, and something that kind of springs out of just sheer will and just faith driving you to achieving the goal. Because we have not yet had some kind of major backing, but our backing comes from the grassroots. It comes from ordinary people who want to be a part of it and want to help out.
Precisely. And I can't help but think of you were mentioning a little bit about sort of the the person on the ground there. I always think of this quote that I think is really beautiful. It was St. Louis the Ninth, right? St. Louis the Ninth.
Mm-hmm.
His mother told him, that she would rather to have him die than commit one mortal sin. And that to me was just like, wow, like that is so hardcore, that's so intense. And I guess and that's what a lot of these crusaders really were had in their head. Kind of talking about that, so me personally, right, for me, one of my favorites, right, is besides somebody like St. Louis the Ninth, maybe a Fernando the Third, right? To me, that's something that
I'm a fan.
Or a Pelayo and stuff like that. For me, just like my personal favorite aspect of the Crusades is like the Spanish Reconquista. Do you have any? You have any part that you have any sort of crusade in particular that is your favorite? Any part? Any king that's your favorite?
King Richard obviously is a huge one for me. I mean, that's one of the reasons I pushed for that with Austin. So the First Crusade is also really, really interesting. And excuse me. But Spain is an area of big interest for me as well. And like you mentioned, Saint Fernando. I love Saint Fernando. He's pretty fascinating. He's Louis the Ninth's cousin. I believe their mothers were sisters, I think. No,
they were cousins. I know that.
I'm trying to remember in what way they were related, but no, that it wasn't in that way. But yeah, we'll have to look that up, I guess. But,
it's a good question.
because his mother was the daughter of Alfonso VIII of Castile. So I'm thinking of two other kings. I can't remember, but yeah, they were both saints, and I do think that Spain it's pretty fascinating. I mean, I do think that Spain is kind of a nation, sort of Spain and Portugal, created through crusading. I mean, the whole identity, like we think about the conquistadors and what Spain was really like at sort of the dawn of the golden age of Spain, like the Spanish Empire. It was a society that had really come of age through crusading, and a lot of the medieval ideals of Christendom endured the longest there. When France and England had long left all that stuff behind, the Spanish were still prizing these ideals and this ideal of crusading in particular. It's kind of interesting. Christopher Columbus was interested in finding a way to get back to the Holy Land. Like, crusading was something that motivated him too. And obviously Queen Isabel, this was a big thing for her. So yeah, that's something I would like to explore with Christian Channel at some point is to do something set in Spain. I think Fernando III would be great. If we could do something about Saint Fernando, that would be, I mean, I would really love to do that. And I think, there would be some interest in that. I mean, I think, the Hispanic world, I mean, this is a saint that they can look to, who, certainly is a component of Spanish-speaking heritage. And, on top of that, you've got the whole crusading and knights and, battlefield victories and all that stuff. So you get that element too. So I think there's a lot to work with there.
Yeah, I mean, definitely you have figures like all the way from like Don Pelayo to like, John of Austria, with Lepanto. For me, I've always thought, something like Lepanto would be an incredible film, because it's huge, sea battle in the middle of the Mediterranean. Is very, very incredible. And we're coming up on the this coming Friday, the feast of Our Lady of Victory.
It's
the Rosary. Yeah.
It's October 7th, isn't it? Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'll actually be streaming that morning, so I'll have to do a little Lepanto tribute.
A little shout out. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I guess in today's world, right? We've talked a lot about it. We've talked a lot about this stuff, and you're talking about the possibilities that you have with future endeavors, future shows. I wish you all the best with that. What lessons or what role, right, do you think that kings / patriarchs can play today in our society?
Well, I think it kind of brings up some of the issues of how authority should actually work, and I think the model in the medieval world was service. I mean, a king was kind of the ultimate servant. That was the ideal anyway. There was a strong feeling that a king should not be somebody who is just a tyrant who dominates other people for the sake of it. And it's interesting because in a lot of civilizations, that's kind of just been the assumption. I mean, that's just what a king is. I mean, in a lot of the ancient Eastern world, for example, who is a pharaoh? A pharaoh is, I don't think there was any concept in ancient Egypt that a pharaoh was some kind of servant of the people or something, or that he was subject to this judgment from God or something like that. He was kind of a god in himself. He was, I guess, it's kind of a exaggerated image, but from the movie 300, when Xerxes shows up, that's kind of more the standard idea of what power is or what a king is. It's just somebody who dominates everybody. And medieval Christendom really did not view it that way at all. I mean, there was a sense that a king, in some ways, the king was the ultimate servant. And I think that it's interesting. I mean, Christ with his crucifixion, there's so much imagery of kingship there. The crown of thorns, the reed at his side, the mock worshiping of him. I mean, I think the point there was that Christ is king, and he is he's God, and yet here he is giving of himself and self-sacrifice to the ultimate end, even as king. As in fact, that's like his role as king, is to sacrifice himself for his people. And I think that's exactly the type of ideal that Richard the Lionheart was trying to live out himself. And that was the ideal of kingship in the Middle Ages. And the church was the model of that. I mean, the popes, that was the idea behind the pope, is that he's the servant of the servants of God. And this was a very strong idea in the Middle Ages. That's why later on, when the papacy became more opulent and wealthy, it was kind of a scandalous thing, because the popes had traditionally been these more simple figures who went around on donkeys and exhorted the kings to repent and do God's will. So yeah, I think that's one lesson I definitely want to get from the show, is this idea that authority should really be about service. And I think that's the Christian ideal of authority, and that's one of the big lessons that Christ himself imparted to us with his own death and his own self-sacrifice for his creation. Yeah,
I mean, would you say that a king that serves his people, a patriarch that serves his people, right, in the same way that like a man in a family is the patriarch, a king would be the leader of his realm? Would you say that that's sort of the prime example of Christ-like meekness?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that you think like you're talking about a father. I mean, like I'm a father myself, and it's, as the father, you're the head of the household. Your wife and children look to you for that leadership, and at the same time, ultimately, what you are is you're entirely dedicated to the good of these people who you are called to lead. So yeah, again, I mean, that's what real leadership is. I mean, the idea that it should be about, just being able to do whatever you want is just not, it's not true at all. I mean, it really is about service, especially to, the weak and the defenseless. I mean, parents give everything to their children because their children can't provide for themselves, at least in part. And that's, you think about why was Richard going to the Holy Land? Well, in part, it was because the Christians there couldn't defend themselves. They needed someone who had the strength, who had the power given by God, put in that position to carry out that power in the proper way, in the defense of the weak.
Yeah, and I think that's so lost on people today. People are very familiar with the idea of a hero, of a strong man, helping the defenseless, and helping the poor, helping the needy. But they don't often realize that comes from knighthood, that comes from the Crusaders and these Crusader kings, and even just the poor man who becomes a knight. This idea of not, might makes right, of just the strong sort of exerting their will on the defenseless. That's that comes from Christianity, that comes from Christ, that comes from the cross, and sometimes people can easily forget that. And honestly, like what you're saying is so true, because when a leader is self-serving, that's really when he becomes a tyrant. They become, and it becomes either tyrannical, or they become ineffective because they're sort of high on their own supply, so to speak. They're just they're just doing everything they can just for their own self pleasure. And that's a really good point. Really incredible. So basically, I have one question that I wanted to ask here. I'm somebody who's really interested in meta narratives, right? In big sort of stories, right? Because sometimes we can get kind of myopic. We can get obsessed with like little tiny details, especially as people who enjoy history. It's easy to do that. But I think sometimes it's more interesting to look at those big sort of things. I've always heard you talk about how the Crusades can be sort of seen as something akin to the battles, the kingdom battles from the Old Testament, the ancient Israelites and stuff like that. And obviously there's a meta narrative there. Obviously, there's sometimes these kings are really good. Sometimes the prophets are, et cetera. And sometimes they fall, right? But there was ultimately a meta narrative about the temple, all that stuff there, and about sort of how well they were obedient to God. Do you think there's an overarching narrative to learn from the Crusades, or not really, or is that not really something that applies?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think there's so much there. I mean, people obviously base entire careers off of teasing out some of this stuff. But yeah, I think that, just to pick on one theme that I think is important from the Crusades, the Old Testament issue. I think that people will ask the question, well, where did they get the idea that, Christians could be warriors? I mean, isn't Christianity supposed to be about just turning the other cheek? And I think that is a misunderstanding of what that verse was about. I mean, Christianity is definitely not pacifist at its heart. But it requires that force be used for the cause of the good. I mean, if you are, especially when you're dealing with your neighbor, rather than getting into a scuffle with your neighbor, it might be better to turn the other cheek and just show mercy, or show a bit of humility in that situation, and maintain Christian brotherly love in that situation. But if you're in a situation where an evil power is harming the innocent, and like, let's say you've got a tyrannical king or something who invades a territory and enslaves a population of people. Well, if you are a ruler, then in fact, it's your Christian obligation to do something about that. So, in fact, it could be sinful not to do something. There are situations where it would be sinful to neglect to act with force if you see someone harming a child, you should intervene. And to not do so, you shouldn't stand there and say, "Oh, well, I'm just going to turn the other cheek." No, you need to do something, especially if you have the power to do it. That's your obligation as a Christian. So I think that's what the Crusades are really about. And we can get into all kinds of debates about which Crusades were justified, or what circumstances were the Crusaders in compliance with the ideal? When did they fail at that ideal? And I think all of that is there in the history. But it's important to understand that medieval Latin Christians really did understand the Crusades to be a part of God's order, and this was the carrying out of God's will. This was doing something for one's fellow man. And a big part of the model for that was in the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, God leads his people into battle for a righteous cause. And this is something that resonated very strongly with medieval Latin Christians. The Old Testament was very important in the Middle Ages. People don't sometimes forget that. And the Old Testament is not deleted because of the New Testament. This is God. This is God acting in the world. You have these warrior kings like David and Joshua, who God does call to battle at times for a righteous cause. And so this was just so apparent to medieval Latin Christians that this was just a part of the right order, and that a Christian ruler was called to act, for the good of a situation, especially when, again, innocent lives are threatened. So I think that, the Old Testament is a huge part of that, and something that we have to consider when we're thinking about the Crusades.
Big time, for sure. And that's really one of the best ways to understand it. And I think if you don't have that comprehension, I think it becomes very confusing. If you see it as something, sort of as an isolated event, and you're like, oh, this is just something that people wanted to gain territory, people wanted to gain money, and then they were justifying it in a different way. But when you see it from the perspective of the people on the ground, it starts to make a lot more sense. So, Jay Stephen, I want to ask, do you have any closing remarks? Anything that you think that people should know?
Well, I guess I'll just end by saying Knights of the Cross is a project that I really do believe in, and I think that we are going to do a lot of awesome things with it, God willing. And but it is a community project. It's something that the only reason I've been able to do anything at all with it is because of the people around me who've contributed to it. The people who contribute financially is one thing, but also just the various team members. Austin Kelly with Christian Channel, again, the guys from Cinema Forte, Aaron and Greg and their crew, who were so instrumental in helping us make this pilot happen. Various reenactors and actors we've worked with, crew members, and also, just the enthusiasm of people who have been donors to the project and who have come out to shoots and been a part of it. Those people have just been so huge, and it's an amazing thing to get that kind of validation from. People show up and they're like, they want to be a part of it, and they want to help make it happen. And it really is just encouraging, because it makes you feel like, okay, yeah, we can actually do this. So I would just say, go to knightsofthecross.com, check out what we're doing, watch some of the clips there, think about contributing. There's everything from little amounts to higher amounts, and there are rewards and stuff that go along with that, opportunities to be a part of it. So check that out, and keep us in your prayers. And I think that, I'm really excited to release the pilot. And, the goal is to, once we release the pilot, that will help us generate the buzz to raise a budget for 2 more episodes. So we're kind of taking it one step at a time in that way. So that's the goal right now.
That's the goal. Where can people find the pilot once it comes out in November?
Well, it's going to be on my YouTube channel. That's where it's going to debut. So you can go to youtube.com/Real Crusades History. So that's just look up Real Crusades History on YouTube. That's where I put all my stuff up. So you'll be able to see it there. And then it'll also be on the Christian Channel website as well. So there will be a couple different places you can see it.
There you go. There you go. So you heard him. You heard him about the pilot. You heard him about KnightsOfTheCross.com, Christian channel, his YouTube channel, Real Crusades History. It's coming out soon. It's going to be big. It's going to be exciting. I really wanted to thank you for coming on. It's been a huge pleasure. We got a comment here saying great interview and informative. There we go. I'm glad that people are enjoying
Thank
it.
you, sir.
I'm glad that people are enjoying it. Glad that it's
Yeah,
okay.
thanks a lot for having me on, Adrian. I really do appreciate you taking the time. So.
No, thank you. Do we have an exact date for the pilot coming out, or is it, or not sure exactly yet?
I don't think Austin has a specific date set yet, but November is the target right now. So, and we're well on our way to meeting that goal. So,
Perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to ask because somebody asked it in the comments there. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for being on here, and it's great to meet you. So yeah, que viva Cristo Rey, and good night, everybody.
Good night.